It's funny how life has a way of pulling the rug out from under you. One minute, you're a happy family, headed to a quiet beach town for a much-needed vacation. The next, you're standing there, watching the sand slip between your fingers and realizing your whole world's been buried under it. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. Just me, my wife Sarah, and the kids, Emily and Ben. We'd booked a cottage by the sea, where the sun was always shining and the water was always blue. You know, the type of place where you can practically hear the sound of waves and relaxation in the air. The kind of vacation that's supposed to restore your soul, make your bond stronger, remind you why you even put up with the stress of daily life. That was the idea, and for a while it worked. For about 2 days, anyway. On day 1, the kids were practically living in the sand, digging holes deep enough to reach China. Sarah and I were sitting in our beach chairs, with the sun on our faces, sipping something fruity, her usual request. I had my beer. Everything felt right. The salt in the air, the sound of Emily's laughter as she buried Ben in the sand, the kids running around with their beach toys. It was blissful. And then there was Sarah, her hair catching the sun just right, the wind gently playing with the edges of her sundress. She looked perfect. The type of woman you think you're lucky to have. The type of woman that doesn't even know how good she looks because she's so natural about it. That was my Sarah. But that day, something fell off, just under the surface. You know that feeling when you're doing something ordinary, but a part of you feels like you're missing a big chunk of the puzzle? I could see it in her eyes. She'd gotten distant over the last few months, but I brushed it off. After all, we were on vacation, right? But no matter how much I tried to enjoy the moment, there was a gnawing feeling in the back of my mind. It wasn't just the kids playing in the sand. It wasn't the waves. It was her. I didn't want to admit it, but I couldn't shake the suspicion. Maybe it was the way she kept glancing at her phone, even though she'd promised to leave work behind. Maybe it was the way her laugh didn't quite reach her eyes when I made a joke about how we should move to the beach and never leave. I tried to ignore it. After all, we were a family, and families don't break up on a whim. Or do they? By the time the kids were worn out, playing with their sandcastles and running around the beach like they had unlimited energy, Sarah's demeanor had shifted. I knew something was wrong, but what could it be? She kept her distance, even when I tried to engage her in conversation. I figured maybe it was just the heat, or maybe she had something on her mind. But when the day ended, when we were back in the cottage, and I caught her on the phone, I knew something wasn't right. She was talking low, her voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but her body language told me everything I needed to know. Her eyes darted to the window like she was making sure no one could hear. And that was the moment I realized. It wasn't the vacation I had planned. It was the beginning of everything falling apart. The moment it hit me, I knew I had to hold it together for the kids. They were oblivious, lost in their own little world. But I wasn't. Something was happening between Sarah and someone else, and I couldn't ignore it. The same feeling that had been creeping up on me for the last few months had now become impossible to deny. I watched Sarah from across the room, pretending to be immersed in whatever conversation she was having, but my mind was already racing. I couldn't stay calm. The lies were there, bubbling beneath the surface. But I couldn't show my hand yet. Not in front of the kids. Not until I had more proof. And so, I spent the next few hours pretending everything was normal, even though I could feel my world crumbling down with every passing second. The next morning, the tension was still there, hanging in the air like the salty mist from the ocean. We were all supposed to be enjoying our time together, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to focus on the kids, on the way they were splashing around in the shallows, their laughter echoing through the air, but my mind kept drifting back to Sarah. It wasn't just her quiet conversations on the phone. It wasn't the way she was acting distant, more than usual, as if she were physically there but emotionally miles away. It was the way she kept glancing at me when she thought I wasn't looking, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Guilt? Indifference? I didn't know, but I wasn't about to ask her. I spent the whole morning walking around the beach, trying to clear my head, but the questions kept swirling around. What was going on with Sarah? Was she unhappy with me? Or was there someone else? Maybe I was being paranoid, overthinking it, but the little things, the quiet moments, the secretive phone calls, the way she'd gone quiet every time I asked her about the future, added up. It felt like I was being pushed out of her world, a world that had once been full of warmth, laughter, and the promise of forever. I couldn't just sit back and pretend everything was fine. So I decided to talk to her, to get to the bottom of it, to ask her what was really going on. But how do you approach something like that? How do you look at the person you've spent your life with, the person you trusted, and ask them if they've been lying to you? I kept watching her throughout the day as she played with the kids, her smile tight, forced. She wasn't as carefree as she used to be. Her laughs didn't reach her eyes, and I could tell she was trying too hard to act like everything was fine. I had seen this before, during those little cracks in our marriage that we both ignored, the moments when we'd gotten too comfortable with our routine, when we'd stopped looking at each other the way we used to. But this was different. This wasn't just the usual tension. This was something deeper, something darker, something I couldn't ignore any longer. Later that afternoon, as the kids took a break from their endless games of sandcastle building and went inside to watch TV, I found myself alone with Sarah on the porch, the sound of the ocean crashing in the background. I tried to act casual as if nothing was wrong, but my heart was pounding in my chest. I couldn't let this go. Not anymore. I needed to know if I was imagining things, if I was just being a fool, or if there was actually something happening that I wasn't seeing. I took a deep breath and turned to her, trying to sound calm, like this was no big deal, but my voice betrayed me. "Sarah, is everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep the worry out of my voice. She looked up at me, and for a split second, I saw something in her eyes, something that made my stomach churn. It was like she knew exactly what I was about to ask, but she wasn't ready to answer. Of course, she replied quickly, too quickly. Why wouldn't it be? I didn't buy it. Not for a second. There was a shift in her tone, a hesitation in her voice, like she was keeping something from me. And that's when I knew. She wasn't just avoiding me. She was hiding something. I took another step closer, trying not to let the anger bubbling inside me show. "Sarah, don't lie to me," I said, my voice a little sharper than I meant it to be. "What's going on? Why have you been acting so strange lately?" For a moment, she looked at me, like she was trying to figure out how to respond, but the words never came. Instead, she turned her gaze to the ocean, as if the crashing waves could somehow answer the question for her. I could feel the silence stretch between us, thick and uncomfortable, as if the weight of everything that had been left unsaid was finally catching up with us. I waited for her to speak, but all she did was shake her head. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice soft, but I could hear the edge in it, the defensiveness. And that was it. I knew. In that moment, I realized I was just a bystander in my own life, watching as everything I thought I knew about my marriage slipped through my fingers like grains of sand. I felt the panic rise in my chest, the fear of losing her, the fear of everything unraveling. But I couldn't show it. Not yet. I had to stay calm. I had to figure out what was really going on before I lost my mind completely. The rest of the day went by in a blur. I forced myself to keep my focus on the kids, on the fun they were having, but my mind kept drifting back to Sarah, to the feeling that something was terribly wrong. When the day came to a close, and we were all sitting down to dinner, I realized just how badly I was fooling myself. Sarah wasn't the same. She wasn't the woman I'd married. And I wasn't sure if I could ever get her back, even if I tried. But I wasn't going to give up. Not yet. Not until I had answers. That night, as the kids fell asleep, I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together the fragments of my life that had suddenly become so blurry. What had happened to us? What had happened to Sarah? What was I missing? I didn't have answers, not yet. But I was getting closer. And soon, I'd have to confront the truth, no matter how painful it was. The days blurred together after that. I could feel the weight of it all pressing down on me more and more, like the ocean tides coming in, relentless and inevitable. We had come to this quiet beach town to reconnect, to find a little peace, but what I found instead was a sea of confusion. Sarah was drifting further away, her distance growing like the gap between two parallel lines that would never cross. The kids, oblivious to the storm brewing between their parents, spent their days digging deeper holes in the sand, making the most of the carefree paradise they didn't even know they were living in. Ben, with his boundless energy, would drag Emily into whatever ridiculous game he'd invented, and she would play along with the kind of joy only kids can have when they're free from the burden of knowing anything about the mess their parents might be in. It was a bittersweet scene, watching them live their best lives while mine was unraveling in the quiet moments when I was alone with Sarah. The silence between us grew louder by the hour, filling the space around us with unspoken words. I tried to be subtle, tried to give her the chance to come forward, but Sarah remained tight-lipped, her eyes avoiding mine more than I had ever noticed before. It was as if the distance between us was becoming something physical, like there was an invisible wall that neither of us dared to touch. I would make small talk, asking her about the kids or what we should do the next day, but she would give short, distracted answers that never quite matched the energy I was used to. Her smile was more of a polite curve than anything genuine, and it felt like I was talking to a stranger who happened to share my bed and our children. Every word from her lips felt like it was just a few inches away from the truth, and yet, she was doing everything she could to avoid saying it out loud. By the fourth day, I couldn't take it anymore. We were sitting at dinner, just the four of us in the little cottage by the sea, when I noticed how Sarah kept glancing at her phone. It wasn't the usual, "I'm waiting for a message" look. It was more like she was checking it for something specific, something she didn't want me to see. Her thumb moved across the screen quickly, too quickly, as if she were trying to keep her secrets hidden behind the glass. I watched her for a moment, trying to keep my cool, but inside I was boiling with frustration. I needed to know. It was all I could think about. The tightness in my chest wouldn't go away, no matter how many times I tried to push it aside. I waited for a moment when the kids were distracted, Ben, as usual, trying to get Emily to eat more of her vegetables by pretending they were alien food from a galaxy far, far away, and then, when there was a lull, I finally broke the silence. "Sarah, is there something you need to tell me?" I asked, my voice low but firm. It wasn't a question I'd ever thought I'd have to ask, but here we were, and I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I needed answers. The frustration that had been building inside me for days now bubbled to the surface. She looked up at me, her expression unreadable, and I saw her eyes dart to the phone one last time before she placed it down on the table. For a second, it felt like time stopped. She sighed, her shoulders slumping in a way I hadn't seen in years. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it hit me harder than anything. "I don't know what you think you know, Jack," she said quietly, not looking me in the eyes. "But whatever it is, you're wrong." It was the kind of response that was designed to deflect, to push me back. But I wasn't backing down. Not this time. "I'm not wrong, Sarah," I said, my voice steady. "You've been distant, avoiding me, and now you're always on that damn phone. This isn't just about work, is it? This isn't just about the kids or the vacation. Something's happening, and I need to know what it is." Her face tightened, and I saw a flash of something I couldn't quite place. Guilt? Annoyance? Maybe a little of both. She sat back in her chair, arms folded across her chest. "Jack, I don't know what you expect from me," she said, her voice rising a little. "I'm just trying to get through this vacation, okay? I'm tired. I'm stressed. I don't need this right now." That wasn't the answer I was looking for, but it was enough to confirm the suspicion I'd been carrying. She was deflecting. She wasn't denying anything directly, but the way she avoided my gaze and the way her words stumbled over each other made it clear. She wasn't just tired. She was hiding something. The rest of dinner was a blur of awkward silences, the clink of silverware against plates, and the occasional nervous laugh from the kids. Sarah and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was only to address the children or to discuss something trivial like the weather. The words we didn't say hung heavy between us, suffocating everything in its path. I could feel the distance growing, and it was all I could do to keep my composure in front of the kids. I didn't want them to see it. Not yet. They were too young to understand that their parents weren't as invincible as they seemed. But the truth was, I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending. As the night wore on, I tried to keep the conversation light. I suggested a family movie night, but Sarah barely responded. She offered a half-hearted smile and agreed, but it was clear her mind was elsewhere. I tried to focus on the kids as we watched the movie together, their laughter filling the room, but it was like a soundtrack to a life that was no longer mine. I wanted to believe that I was overreacting, that maybe I was imagining things, but deep down I knew. Something had changed, and whatever it wasn't going away. By the fifth day, the tension was no longer just something I could feel in the quiet moments. It had become a living, breathing thing, hovering around us like an unseen fog that refused to lift. The kids were still having the time of their lives, oblivious to the undercurrent of unease that had taken over their parents. Ben was busy building a sandcastle fortress, which, according to him, was going to be the strongest one ever, while Emily was perfectly content to splash in the shallow waves. I watched them, trying to hold on to the feeling of normalcy, of being a family, but it was hard to ignore the gnawing sense of dread that kept crawling up my spine. I knew something was happening between Sarah and someone else, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out, one way or another. I tried to act like everything was okay, but every glance at Sarah, every moment I caught her sneaking looks at her phone or pulling away from me when I got too close, made the knot in my stomach tighten. She was withdrawing more and more, and it wasn't just the stress of the vacation. I could feel it in the way she stopped sharing little details of her day with me, the way she avoided eye contact when we spoke. It was as if I had become a stranger in my own home, and the worst part was, she wasn't even pretending anymore. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, that I was overthinking things, but as the days passed, I knew, deep down, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to confront her. I had to ask the questions that had been lingering at the back of my mind, no matter how much I dreaded the answers. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of pink and orange, I finally did it. We were sitting on the porch again, the air cool against my skin, the sound of the ocean washing over us. The kids were inside, watching TV, and the moment felt like it could go either way. I turned to Sarah, my heart pounding in my chest, and asked, "Is there something you need to tell me?" It wasn't a casual question. It was everything I had been holding back for the past few days, every fear, every doubt, finally spilling out in one simple sentence. I knew it was time. It had to be. She didn't look at me right away. Instead, she stared out at the horizon, her fingers drumming absent-mindedly on the arm of the chair. I could see her hesitate, weighing her options. I could see the guilt written all over her face, even though she tried to hide it. For a moment, I thought she might lie, or worse, say nothing at all. But then she looked at me, her eyes finally meeting mine, and for the first time in days, I saw her face soften, as if she was finally ready to let the truth come crashing down. "I don't know how to say this, Jack," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "But yes, there's something I need to tell you." My breath caught in my throat, but I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I had to let her speak, to let her confess. "I've been seeing someone," she said, her voice trembling now. "It started out innocent, just talking. I never meant for it to go this far, but it did. I didn't know how to stop it, how to make it right." For a moment, I was frozen. It was like the world around me stopped turning, and all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. I couldn't process what she was saying. I had known, deep down, that this was coming. But hearing her say it out loud, saying it with such shame and regret, was something I wasn't prepared for. The pain hit me in waves, sharp and brutal, crashing over me until I could barely catch my breath. "Who is he?" I asked, my voice rough, strained. I didn't even recognize the tone anymore. I sounded like a man who had lost everything. She hesitated again, and for a brief moment, I thought she might say it was nothing, that it didn't mean anything. But then she spoke again, her voice barely audible. "It's John," she said. "Your best friend." The words felt like a punch to the gut. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. John? My best friend? The man I had trusted like a brother? The one who had spent holidays at our house, played basketball with me every weekend, laughed at all my dumb jokes? I felt like I had been hit by a truck. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. John had always been there for me. How could he betray me like this? How could Sarah, the woman I had loved for years, be the one to fall into this kind of trap with him? I had to blink a few times to focus, to clear the fog in my mind. This couldn't be happening. "I'm so sorry, Jack," she said, tears welling up in her eyes now. "I never meant for this to happen. I was lonely, and he made me feel seen. You were always so busy, always gone, and he was there, talking to me, listening to me. And before I knew it, everything had changed." I sat there, numb, my mind racing. Every word she said felt like it was tearing me apart piece by piece. I couldn't even look at her anymore. The betrayal was too much, too overwhelming. She wasn't just betraying me. She was betraying everything we had built, every promise we had made. And John was supposed to be my friend. The one person I could always count on. How could they do this? How could they destroy everything with such careless disregard? I stood up abruptly, pacing the small porch. I needed space, needed time to process the reality of what had just been revealed. The air felt thick, suffocating, and I couldn't catch my breath. Everything was spinning, and all I could think about was how everything I had trusted, everything I had built with Sarah, had been nothing but a lie. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the fact that Sarah had betrayed me, or that I had no idea how long it had been going on, how long I had been blind to it. "I don't even know what to say to you right now," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know who you are anymore, Sarah. I don't know who I am." And with that, I walked inside, leaving her standing there on the porch, the woman I had once loved, now a stranger to me. The days after Sarah's confession were a blur. I don't remember much of what happened next, other than the overwhelming feeling of betrayal that seemed to flood every inch of my being. I spent most of my time either trying to escape it all by taking long walks on the beach or sitting in silence, letting the sounds of the ocean drown out the chaos in my mind. I couldn't look at Sarah without feeling a wave of anger and disbelief wash over me. It wasn't just what she had done. It was the way she had done it, the way she had betrayed everything I had believed in. John, my best friend, the man I trusted more than anyone, was now a part of that betrayal. And for what? A few stolen moments of attention? I couldn't wrap my head around it. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the truth was, nothing would ever make it right. The kids were, of course, still blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them. Ben and Emily kept running around the beach like nothing had changed, as if their world hadn't just been shattered by the actions of the two people they loved most. And that, more than anything, broke my heart. How was I supposed to explain this to them? How was I supposed to tell them that the family they thought they knew, the family they thought was unbreakable, was falling apart right in front of them? I didn't want to ruin their innocence. I didn't want them to feel like they had to choose sides or carry the weight of our mistakes. So, I did what any father would do in that situation. I tried to protect them. I kept the conversations light, the explanations non-existent. I told them we'd be going back home soon, and that everything would be okay. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be. I knew this vacation, this perfect escape we had all been hoping for, was over. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed to crumble under the weight of her own guilt. She tried to talk to me, tried to apologize, but her words felt hollow. She told me she didn't know why it happened, that it had started out so small, so innocent, but somewhere along the way it had spiraled out of control. She begged me to forgive her, to work through it, to somehow pretend that none of this had happened. But how could I? How could I ever look at her the same way again? The trust that had once been the foundation of our marriage was shattered beyond repair, and no amount of apologies could glue it back together. I wanted to believe in her, to believe that she was still the woman I had married, but the truth was, I didn't know who she was anymore. And John? The man who had been my closest friend? I didn't even know how to begin to process that. I had spent years confiding in him, laughing with him, sharing my deepest secrets and fears, only to find out that he had been a part of my wife's betrayal all along. The anger I felt toward him was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I wanted to confront him, to scream at him, to demand answers, but what was the point? No words would change the fact that both of them had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I spent the next few days in a fog, doing my best to keep the kids entertained while trying to ignore the wreckage that was my marriage. We visited the local shops, walked along the shore, and tried to pretend that everything was fine, but I could see it in Sarah's eyes. She was watching me, waiting for me to say something, anything, to tell her that we could fix it. But I couldn't. I couldn't fix something that had been broken so completely. Every time I looked at her, I was reminded of what she had done, and it was a pain I couldn't shake. The thought of continuing on like nothing had happened was unbearable. I couldn't pretend that everything was okay when everything had fallen apart. The moment of reckoning came when we were packing up to leave. The kids were already excited about the prospect of going home, oblivious to the gravity of the situation. They were eager to get back to their routines, to their friends, to the life they knew. But for me, leaving this place meant more than just going back to our house. It meant facing the reality of what Sarah and I had become. As I packed up the car, Sarah stood by the cottage, watching me. She tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. I could tell she wanted to make everything right, to somehow undo the damage that had been done, but I couldn't do that. I couldn't just forgive her and move on. I couldn't ignore the fact that she had broken my heart, that she had taken everything I had trusted and torn it apart. I don't know how to fix this, Jack, she said quietly, her voice cracking. I don't know how to make you believe me again. I didn't have an answer for her. I didn't know how to make things right, either. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living in the lie we had built. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay when it was clearly falling apart. So, I nodded, barely able to hold myself together. I don't know either, Sarah, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I don't know if we can fix this. The drive home was long, the silence in the car suffocating. The kids chattered away in the back, completely unaware of the emotional wreckage that was taking place in the front seat. I could feel Sarah's eyes on me, but I couldn't bring myself to look at her. Not yet. Not when the weight of everything that had happened was still so raw. When we got home, everything felt different. The house, which had once been a place of comfort and warmth, now felt cold and unfamiliar. The familiar walls seemed to close in on me, reminding me of what had been lost. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if Sarah and I could ever get back to what we once had. But one thing was clear, I couldn't go on pretending that nothing had happened. I needed time, space, and a chance to figure out who I was without the woman I had thought I'd known my whole life. As I sat in the quiet of the living room, watching the kids play, I realized that no matter how hard I tried to move forward, the past would always be a part of me. And whether Sarah and I could ever rebuild what we had was a question I wasn't ready to answer. All I knew was that everything had changed, and there was no going back.